this morning, and things are going to continue in that strain. We're so welcome. We're so welcome. We're delighted to invite you back, and we have 3 fabulous speakers this afternoon, and each of the speakers is going to get 20 minutes. We had scheduled, 20 minutes, half an hour for a plenary discussion, but we need to hear the voices of participants who have so many fascinating things to say that need to be heard. So without further ado, we are going to hear from Santhi Corcoran, and we're going to hear about her research. So give her a good round of applause.
I just want to say from the beginning that my research is about voices, and I wanted to hear the voices of young people, their teachers, their parents, but also their principals in secondary schools about what it's like to understand diversity and equality. And so a lot of what I'm telling you are more, if you like, about stories that they've told me. So it's not a lot of data and graphs, because I thought that'd be enough for that, and I'll try to make it from a very different perspective. So my research is called Exploring a New Paradigm for Intercultural Competence and Teacher Preparedness in Irish Secondary Schools. And the reason I pick secondary schools is I feel these are young people in the cusp of adulthood. How are we providing a holistic education that enables them to have this broad worldview that we want, so there can be these next generation of people that bring a better nuanced understanding of equality. And the approach I took was, I initially, before I started my doctoral research, I was at a teaching conference, and I asked a single question. I was a participant, and I asked the coordinator of the program, could I ask one question when we have the plenary session? And she said yes. And I asked, do you think Ireland is an ethnocentric nation? And there was an eruption of conversation in the room. And I actually, if you could actually have it in a visual context, I moved out of the room, and this whole group of teachers started to have almost a tribal conversation. It went on to nationalism, it went on to identity, it went on to so many levels of interesting aspects of what people felt about ethnocentrism. And I looked at this particular comment from the NCCA, the people who kind of involved with the curriculum in Ireland. And what they said there, I thought, was very important. And when I started my doctoral research, which was in 2015, I didn't feel this has still become the norm in schools. So this is my research overview. The study was exploring intercultural awareness of teachers and students, and I used a particular model. I thought rather than use something very different to their sense of understanding, I used a curriculum as a framework. And the curriculum is SPHE and CSPE, which is a civic and citizenship education program that children have to do from year 1 in secondary to year 3. One of them is an exam subject, the other isn't. That's the CSPE, okay, which is civic, social, and political education. And I wanted to see how do they weigh the knowledge they were gathering from this, because ultimately there's a lot of repetitive and interlinking aspects to this curriculum. And I wanted to know, did they learn anything from it? So I actually used the context that rather than ask the first, second, and third years in secondary school, I'll ask the kids who've just finished it. So they were in 4th year, so they're 16-year-olds, at an age where they're quite articulate about what they liked and what they didn't like and what they know and they don't know. And ask them if this program, this curriculum, gave them this better nuanced understanding and worldview. And I wanted the parents' opinion about whether they thought there was any benefit to it. Are we doing something that's worthwhile here? Is it teaching them anything? And I wanted to look at the school's leadership about promoting change. How did that work with all of this? Why are we delivering something that's just something for kids to remember today and forget tomorrow? Are we actually creating this holistic understanding? And I wanted to approach it from the perspective of human rights. And so what they would be learning in that curriculum, human rights, equality, discrimination, racism, did it make sense? Did it all connect? Did they see discrimination and bullying as being in the same continuum? So this was my rationale for my research, because Ireland is becoming incredibly diverse. And there is a huge cultural shift due to that. And what young people's attitudes about that change, I think, is important to record important to understand. And Ireland itself is diverse. And I say this when I work with groups and when I'm teaching. This is a diverse country in itself. It's not as homogeneous as we think it is. And that is something that misses the perception and understanding of young people, but also people who are training to be teachers, because I work with them as well. So why does understanding this matter? Because, as I said earlier in our discussion, I think understanding exclusion gives you a better insight of what inclusion is. And I think that is important. It also meets a lot of requirements for the future that they will face. You know, the global world that they need to live and work in. The global world is on their doorstep, actually. You know, it's not something they have to go out to the way people used to emigrate to get that experience before. And so we need to kind of raise awareness, educate, and empower young people for this new world that they will be living in and working in. Because they're the future citizens. What we do or don't do, I think, is in our watch in terms of what we help young people to be skillful in. And also I think it's important for teachers who then have to work with them in the classroom. Children spend 12 years of their life significantly in classrooms. What are we doing in that classroom to help them become this holistic, capable young people who can see the world and hear the world and understand the world better? So what I hoped something like this would achieve in schools is there a process here that, without my bias coming into the picture, I'm a mother of a teenager. My son is now 17, so he's been through this curriculum. So I have to put up my hand and say that's why my interest was sparked. I did not go to school in this country, so it was very interesting to see this. So I wanted to see, you know, is this creating a sustainable, equitable classroom for all pupils? Was it doing that? You know, was there awareness of the broader world? Were they able to see, hear, and understand the world without limitations of ignorance and prejudice? It's a big ask, but are we actually preparing them, training them, educating them? And I know the gentleman there spoke about how the brain functions. How are we trying to help them see the world better? And to facilitate this, how are the teachers being prepared? How are they being engaged? How are they engaging the children in their classroom in meaningful discussions and discourses? Are they creating that safe space for them to do that? And what are the roles that principals are playing in this process? So I used an action research method with, it's an action research study with a mixed methods design. So I did a survey first, and the survey was then going to inform the interviews that I was going to do. So there were 5 secondary schools in the West of Ireland participated. There were 17 initially. I found the first thing I did was I formed a relationship with the gatekeepers. Schools are very protective spaces, believe it or not, and they are quite fed up with the number of research requests they get on a weekly basis. And as one principal said, it's like drive-by shooting. It lands on my table, and it's basically saying, this is research, almost as if presuming I'm going to do it. And then I hear nothing about it afterwards. So I took a very different approach. I actually formed a relationship with the education officer. I formed a relationship with the principals by saying, this is what I'm going to do. Does this fit in with what you want to see, what you want to hear? Will this help you? Will this benefit you? It'll have a benefit for me. I'll get a doctorate at the end of it. But what does it benefit you? And most of them came back and said, we would like to participate. We actually like this approach. But as I said, being a doctoral student on my own, I couldn't do 17 schools, so I asked them to be self-selecting, and they did. And it's a mixed group, socioeconomically, in terms of urban-rural divide, and they were all mixed-gender schools. And as I said, they were 16-year-olds, people who had been through the 3 years of that curriculum. And that's a research question that I tried to explore to see what is it enriching in terms of a culturally sensitive and equitable learning environment if it's presented well, and what would the issues that arise from this, and how could we design a program that would help teachers with their continuous professional development so they could be more empowered and capable of this. So we did this data collection in 2 phases. So the survey of teachers, students and parents, and it was an electronic survey. And I have to say the electronic survey went down really well with the students because I managed to persuade the principals that they could bring their phone in because it could be done on the phone. You know, so they got a URL address and they went in and we got good intake. And as some of the transition year coordinators of the school said, probably you got the best response that you could ever get because if it was paper, it won't come back. You know, a whole heap of nonsense would be done in it, but it was done in record time because they always sit there with their iPads, etc. And for that one brief moment, bring their phones inside the classroom. So, as I said, having a 17-year-old teenage son helps a good deal. And the second bit will be interviews with principals and head teachers, and I'll explain a bit more about this. And I agreed with them that I would disseminate this finding as part of a continuous professional development program and a seminar that I would help co-create with what they wanted and with what the education officer will be able to provide. So that is the next phase. So the research, the data has been collected and the research is kind of more or less in terms of analysis done. So the next phase is doing the CPD, which again all the schools have been very interested in participating in. When I asked schools and principals what did they think they would gain from participating in this, these are the things they said, having looked at the questionnaire, which they also got involved in and gave me tips and ideas of what they felt would work, wouldn't work. They felt it would support some of their whole school evaluations, they could use it for their parents' charter, dash reports, the well-being program that the schools had to roll out, and their youth service program particularly was interested. I used one patronage because the ethos was very similar, so I wanted that similarity to work with, because otherwise it would have been quite unyielding, if you like. But I thought it was interesting that the youth service people were also interested in it. And for me, it felt that this research then was meaningful, because I was actually giving something back. So these are the students' voices. I asked them about the social personal health education program, which is all about the personal self, the holistic self, growing and developing, etc. And these are the things they said. Now, as I said, these are students' voices. I'm actually saying what they said, rather than overanalyzing it or even paraphrasing it. Communications, class discussion activities, that was good, they enjoyed that. Learning about different groups, diversity, they enjoyed that. Bullying, mental health, they felt was important. Health, well-being, drugs education. Enjoyed least, teacher was not often present, we did nothing. This is the non-exam subject, right? Teacher not engaged with the subject. Found topics boring, not interesting, some areas. Students' voices for the civic, social and personal political education program. They liked the project groups, they loved the current affairs, they went on visits that they thought was good. Some said they didn't go on any visits at all, so these are the ones who did get to go on visits. Understanding the justice political system, having guest speakers really seemed to spark an interest in the world around them. Like learning about other cultures. And then enjoyed least lack of teacher enthusiasm for the subject. Topics were not interesting, did not learn anything. Did not learn anything about refugees, did not like learning about refugees, social issues. I thought that was quite interesting. Because that, I think, clicks back to I'm not comfortable. I'm uncomfortable with some of these things that I'm hearing. Can I say that I hear this from teacher trainees who are doing the BA program in their first year? So these are secondary pupils who are 2 years away from getting to university. And if they become teachers, I'm hearing the same thing from them. So I then asked them, what would they teach? Now I have to say there's vast data. The questionnaires are different, but I picked the ones that I felt was much more relevant to this presentation, but also what was overall said about them. But I asked them then the question, which I don't think is often asked, if you were to teach this program, what would you have in the curriculum? How would you develop and design this program? Mental health, managing it, supporting it, supporting others, emotional health, mindfulness. Mental health just came up, I know. And at one point I actually stopped my analysis because I have a background as a clinician and as a social psychologist, and I sat there and I felt really, really concerned. The amount of times mental health clicked over and over and over again. Being a young adult, friendships, relationships, that was very important. They talked a lot about it. And I would have liked to have actually even just done a questionnaire on that. Bullying and its impact, equality, racism, discrimination, how to prevent it, how do I stop this? It's happening to people I know, you know. Grief, loss, suicide, kind of almost unspoken in there. Sexism, feminism, xenophobia, homophobia, sexuality, sexual health, sexual behavior, consent. Consent popped up, you know. What is the right and wrong thing to do, you know. Social issues, homelessness, life skills, insight into other people's lives, abortion, pregnancy, parenting, raising children. I thought that was interesting, raising children. How do I parent? How do I raise a child? And actually, I think that's a beautiful program, but we're not to let competence schools. And the data analysis for the teachers, 3.3% of all participating teachers said they had adequate training in teaching. Adequate, not adequate. That's a very small number. And 6.5% had requested to teach SPHE, and only 40.6% had asked to teach this. So I asked them more about this, and they said they were asked to teach by management. Did not feel suitably qualified to train. Was not necessarily an area of interest. Would rather teach core subjects. Again, the weighting and value came into position. These were the main, core subjects were exam subjects. They were important subjects according to how the curriculum and the Department of Education saw it. SPHE is not an exam subject, so I'm not sure about that one. But, you know, CSB maybe, it kind of falls in the middle category. Don't know enough about different cultures. And yet it was a great space to actually learn, explore together, co-collaborate, and understand about different cultures. Felt diversity was quite difficult to deal with in the classroom, different values. Teachers saying that, I feel uncomfortable because I feel there's different values here between that different child, myself, and the parent. Important to be culturally aware, sensitive to all groups, so you've got the more positive side, which, by the way, there were a number as well. But I was struck by the number who felt overwhelmed. And I think one of my colleagues from RAI said she does feel sympathy for them, because I do think these young people go into third level, into university education, and when they do some of their teacher training, they don't have that framework, or the frame of reference even to work with. Language difficulty was a challenge. A lot was lost in translation. A lot of misunderstandings were happening, but also just the nuances of body language, etc. All of that was kind of being lost. And I often say that students and teachers, from the first moment they meet each other, whether it's a new term or a new class, you're co-constructing your image and understanding of each other. And that happens everywhere. It happens in this room when we meet each other. So the fact that that psychology wasn't being applied in terms of how you deliver teaching and learning, to me was interesting. Because if you understand that your student is looking at you with the same biases, judgments and discriminations as you perhaps are, and both of you are too uncomfortable to go around that or near that, how are you going to have a dialogue that opens up your thinking to differences? So, you know, I think that was a kind of quite a poignant thing that came through. So I asked these teachers, prior to this question, I said, what are you comfortable teaching? And I listed all of these things. And they said, fine, happy to teach all of these things, except sexuality. That was a bit of a problem for every single school, every single questionnaire. But they were happy enough, I'm very comfortable teaching the rest. And then I asked this question, because I actually designed that questionnaire myself, and I used slightly psychometric thinking around it. So having them said, well, happy and confident teach everything except sexuality, I then asked, what further training would you like? Thinking that sexuality would be the only one. Every single one of them came up. And then the commentary then was, I actually do need help. I actually don't get it. The intercultural education curriculum is like a course in itself. I can't work it because I'm unwieldy. I don't have a frame of reference for this. So those were everything that they were asking. So that's, you know, a huge number of things that they felt I don't feel comfortable with. 5 schools, a lot of teachers, and that's the answer that I got. So I asked the parents, now bless them, I have to say this is the only issue that I have to highlight. Parents struggle with the electronic format. You know, the principals and teachers themselves said, we find text responses work best. So this is a great idea. It'll go to their phones and they will be able to do it. What we found was they were not as nuanced and capable as their children at doing it. But the parents who did do it, I felt gave an idea that I actually had about where their understanding of that curriculum stood with their children. Most were confused about the exact nature of the curriculum, and they couldn't differentiate between the two. It was a bit confusing, because they felt there was a lot of similarities and repetition, so which was what. Generally they felt it must be useful, helpful, and I said that with the word must, because it was almost a question mark. It must be useful, it must be beneficial. They're doing it for 3 years. Some reported their children have been positive, of the experience, seemed to display better understanding diversity issues that we surveyed. Others felt it wasn't delivered well, and the weighting and value placed on the exam subject took away from the more holistic subject, which is SPH. So understanding of basic well-being, expanding their children's knowledge and well-being was seen as good, but they weren't sure if that was happening the way it should. So what was the principal's role in all of this? Having done the survey, I felt very strongly that I can go further without looking at leadership in schools. Because ultimately, principals need to be equally supportive of this. They are the representatives of the collective vision of the school. They are the people who promote and advocate for their teachers and their school community. And they are the ones who should be leading in this change, in this very different time period that they were principals in. So the interview with the principals was based on grounded theory. I used 8 semi-structured open interviews. It provided a prompt for interviews, and the interviews basically were given the time to explore the questions I gave them. So this is what, and this will be the kind of final bit of this research, what the principal said, which is all principals describe their schools, classrooms as being more diverse or very multicultural, but they said, my classrooms are multicultural, my staff room is not. They felt there were no role models for ethnic minority students, there were no representations on the abortion management from Black minority and Asian communities. Students accepted diversity, but attitudes to tribal children they felt was worse than even to migrant children, which is something that we have come to know. Sexuality was an issue that needed to be addressed better. They felt they had huge issues around teaching about sexuality. And some of them raised the awareness about Wales schools, which is like Irish medium schools, where everything is taught only in Irish. They felt there was almost a segregated approach happening there. There was less diversity in those schools than in any other schools.
I think our time is up just because we're under pressure. So, I mean, thank you so much. Can we give Santhi a round of applause? Fantastic food for thought in that presentation. There's so much there. Can you turn to the person beside you? One thing that you responded to in that presentation while Karl is setting up. And thank you so much, Santhi. One thing, any one thing. Okay? Can I call you back? I'm sorry to pressurize us. Our next presentation is Dr. Karl Kitching. And without further ado, give him a round of applause for
Let's give a round of applause for not doing anything. Much appreciated. So what I'm going to talk about is the issue of family belonging, and more specifically the issue of school choice within or around that. So I'll just give you a little sense of where the study is coming from. A little bit of the ideas, concepts of research, etc. around parent choice and values, mobilities and immobilities, and complex unequal publics. The idea that I suppose the discourse that I'm suggesting that we need to move towards in terms of policy in Ireland. The reason I'm specifically focusing on this area is, as I think one of the first questions from the morning session was about parental choice. This context of the study, I won't get a chance to go into the policy issues too much, but we can hopefully get a bit of a chance to talk about it at the end. The study itself comes from an Irish Research Council funded study, the fieldwork comes from an Irish Research Council funded study called Making Communion, Disappearing and Emerging Forms of Childhood in Ireland. So we did a lot of participatory research activity with children, and this was during the 2013, during the first 6 months of 2013. Over 100 children in 4 different school sites, both Catholic and Educate Together. And also we interviewed 39 parents individually, but also in pairs and focus groups. As part of this, also in the different school localities we were in, we interviewed senior citizens and young people from the secondary schools in those same localities. So essentially it's an intergenerational study. looking at lots of different things around, say, school choice, religious and non-religious worldviews, and I'm hoping to, well, I am going to have a book out, I'm writing a book at the moment on this called Childhood, Religion and School Injustice, which hopefully will be out in the autumn of next year. So, just conceptualizing choice for a minute, and I suppose the complexities around school choice. As I'm sure many people are aware, there are multiple unequal affordances and constraints that shape the moral geographies of parents' choice. And when I say moral geographies, I mean the sorts of moral dilemmas and the values that parents express in relation to the landscape that they have, that they are part of. So it's literally a geography that is morally contested. So issues like things like their situated upbringing, whatever that tradition is or none, prayer networks, the space and time budgets that Stephen Ball talks about, geographies of school type, which is a major issue in Ireland, of course, child-specific contingencies like if a child with special educational needs, and communitarian or individualist political orientations. All of those things feed into the capacity to choose a school or not, as the case may be. And we know that school markets, which are very prevalent in the UK, and obviously Ireland has unofficially had secondary school markets forever. More and more, I suppose my point in this talk is that the primary school sector is becoming more and more marketised in terms of the discourse of choice and individual competition. So school markets exploit parent values in paradoxical ways. For example, Diane Ray and Jill Crozier have done work in the UK on how parents who are left-leaning, for example, and who want to send their child to a community college or community school, they find the research there has found that those children tend to benefit more than, we're talking about white middle-class parents, their children tend to benefit more, even in those settings, than, say, having sent them to an elite school. In terms of, say, things like, well, they're more literate around ethnic diversity, for example, or those children are more likely to be in the higher streamed subjects and tracks. So there's lots of contradictions in terms of what parents intend and what actually turns out. And also, but I suppose it's important not to lose faith, pardon the pun, in the whole issue of parental choice, in the sense that, you know, it's certainly your religious or non-religious worldview has a role to play in the school that you send your child to, but it's often also a proxy for social class, for race, for gender, in various different ways that I display with the data. But that doesn't, just because religious and non-religious views are linked to material interests, it doesn't mean that humans are by invention or intrinsically cynical in having those religious or non-religious interests. I suppose there's a very interesting article by Pelandini Signani who talks about it's actually the normative nature of morality itself that links our religious views to our material interests. So in a particular field, and I'm talking in Borgesian terms, I suppose the norms that are recognized in that particular field are the norms that gain symbolic power. So that is the nature of religious and non-religious choice, is that it is materially grounded. It refers to material interests, and we shouldn't just see it as this abstract set of beliefs that we are pious about. There is obviously contestation in that field, and that's part of human life. Sorry about the text here, it's a bit small. What I'm focusing on in terms of the data is the issue of mobility and immobility and the differences between different families in that regard. It's really, an argument that I'm making in the book is that geography and place, in terms of place and scale, is really vital to understanding how school choice plays out and how secular and religious relationships play out in different local settings. So William Connolly argues that deeply committed pluralists prize cultural diversity amongst all other things and are prepared to support people across different scales. It's really important in this field that we're having a discussion about place and scale, because if you think about, for example, how a queer religious child or teenager, for example, where does she or he get their solidarity from? It may be from someone on the internet in Canada, you know. So that whole issue of place and scale is really important to the formation of identities, and it cuts across different geographical scales. So belonging and citizenship, following on from that, involve contestations of secular, religious, class, racialized and gendered identities, from the individual body to global policy borrowing. And I suppose the global policy borrowing and the discourse that we're very much talking about now is choice, but it's consumer choice. right, it used to be professed in terms of the religious conscience of the parent, and now it's very much more explicitly referring to active parental choice, and it's a code usually for class in particular. The concept of mobility is really important. It refers to relative social, spatial, collective and individual movement and exchange of bodies, objects, media, and you'll see the types of mobilities and immobilities that I'm talking about in a few minutes with the data. And I just make reference to Amin's work on schools as micro-publics. You know, obviously the public-private divide breaks down when you talk about the school sector in Ireland, or in fact in any other country. There's no such thing as a neatly public or private school in any way, because of economic funding reasons, because of cultural makeup of the school, etc. But it's very clear that the Catholic Church globally, and the Catholic Church in Ireland, is becoming deprivatized, and what that means is drawing more and more into secular modernist notions of citizenship, inclusion, diversity, etc. So in that sense, the Catholic school is becoming more and more a public space, if you like to call it that, but I suppose what that actually looks like and who the public is really what I'm trying to get at. So, yeah, I'll just give you a sense of some of the data from different school settings. So this is some parents from a rural Catholic setting. Susan is Protestant, and Helen and Maria, in a separate interview, are Catholic. So Susan, I suppose the concrete ways the local place, community and belonging are defined and contested became evident in the parental interview analysis. Now Susan, despite living in the area for 10 years, defines her family as blow-ins because they are non-native, i.e. from the UK, and non-Catholic, her words. And when they acquired permanent employment in the city, and this whole idea of mobility is important here, Susan and her husband Graham decided to buy a house, and Graham wanted to live in the countryside, not the city. This white middle-class family with 2 children enjoyed a degree of mobility which could support this counter-urban move, and Susan stated they chose the Fairglen Catholic school because it's around the corner. There is a non-denominational school, that's what she called it, they don't call it that in Educate Together anymore. In the city, I think the Educate Together school, but I didn't want to commit children to travelling half an hour each way, sorry about the jumping text, you know, twice a day. So it's a good school, it's up the road, and you have to weigh the positives and negatives. And because I work part-time, I can walk the children up to school. I think it's very important. It's nice to start the day where we can talk. So mobilities are afforded in social class terms here, in terms of property in the countryside, commuting for part-time work, but there's also immobility in gender terms if you think about having to prioritise domestic work over career work, a theme which affected many women. Now, I'm not saying Susan had a problem with that, but it was a very common theme amongst parents. Pretty much all of them were mothers in the fieldwork. In socio-religious terms, Susan was also acutely conscious of the Catholic habitus of what she called the community, and that she will never be a local. But she works hard for a level of belonging and recognition to alter the place and what the place means. So she was involved in the Parents Association, she was involved in the Brownies, she was involved in every single thing that she possibly could be in order to develop that level of recognition. Getting to know other parents through the school was key for many mothers across the study, regardless of their social status, to offset relative immobility in the domestic sphere or isolation from the life of the school. So Maria there, who was born and reared and worked in a nearby city, met John, who was from Fairglen, the village, and moved there when they married. Helen, who is from the next parish, and she said she didn't venture far, also attended a city secondary school, but both Helen and herself were very comfortable as locals and articulated the reasons for sending their children to Fairglen as, well, it's just convenient really. We live literally 5 minutes away from the school. I just work part-time for my husband, but when I was working full-time and your children are minded in the area, so convenience for your childminder as well. But the thing is, they don't face, it's the wallpaper of their environment, this school. They don't have to think about difference in that respect. So they wouldn't be very actively Catholic in the sense of regularly practicing, but they would have beliefs. Now suburban areas outside of a major city that were examined in the study tended to be more socioeconomically and ethically mixed. Many families had moved country for a better life, and many others had moved from other suburban areas around the city so that they could buy a reasonably affordable home. All families faced varying levels of uncertainty regarding the schools available to them, with a number of schools only recently established. Similar to Catholic schools, inequalities emerged in which Educate Together school it was possible to send one's child to, and who constituted the school, this clustered school locality was highly complex. Nicole, who had moved from quite a disadvantaged area in her childhood and youth, found a lot of gatekeeping in other schools, regardless of ethos, and that was a big problem for her. So I went to the Catholic school. She's Catholic herself and actually runs now the Catholic school after school classes, even though she wasn't even clear what an Educate Together school was before she went there. I went to the Catholic school and I got a bad vibe the minute I walked in. I found the secretary wasn't very helpful. She was asking loads of questions first. It wasn't about Catholicism as such. And I was saying, I'm not going to put a deposit down without knowing what my child is getting involved in. I said, did you feel there's an attitude towards you? And she said, yeah, that she's probably coming from Termonford, which is like a not as prestigious suburban area nearby. When I went back down and met Ravenhill's principal, the name of the suburban Educate Together that's at the top, I just got a real good vibe of the school, and he let me look around the school, got real comfort. I didn't get that from the other Educate Together, which is very high to middle class and longer established. Again, you have to pay the deposit. Obviously, the issue of oversubscription was important there. Parents in Deansfort Educate Together, which she references here, a predominantly middle-class white suburban school, were acutely conscious of the school's reputations and their associated neighbourhoods. Therese and Grace, in the next quote, are both white Irish and practicing Catholics, but did not send their children to the closest existing Catholic school, St. Brendan's. Therese said, I wasn't specifically looking for an Educate Together. It didn't matter to me really if my daughter could have got a place in a more middle class, long-established Catholic school, which is about 10 minutes drive away. We would have gone there because we're Catholic and we do the religion outside of the school here. And what was it about St. Brendan's, a closer Catholic school? And she said, it's not in a very nice area and that attracts a certain demographic. Kate said, rough enough, like Grace said, I chose Deansfort Educate Together because I literally live next door. At that stage, the school had a really good name. If there had been a Catholic school at the end of the road, I probably would have chosen that. But Deansfort had a good reputation. And then they go on to talk about, there's a different feel about this place. It's respectful to the children, respectful to adults. With their literacy and numeracy, I think they get those skills in any school, which is quite an interesting assumption. Here, I think they're very outspoken. They're not afraid to step up. So it's interesting that the basis of Deansfort reputation was overtly described in terms of children's outspoken agency, but somewhat contradictorily, this was encoded in terms of a context that was not rough. So if you're outspoken, you can be outspoken as long as you're not rough, if you like to put those two things together. Waiting lists and the requirement of Catholic baptismal certificates are being outlawed from September in Ireland, in part because of campaigns by groups like Equate and Education Equality. However, the more subtle stigmatization and immobilization of families and neighbourhoods through school encounters and parent grapevines like this one are seen in the roughness attributed to St. Brendan's and the vibe felt by Nicole are much harder to tackle. A number of Nigerian parents also engaged with both African Pentecostal churches and Catholic schools as a way of negotiating the dynamics of ethnic and religious inclusion and exclusion in their locality. So Esther, as a parent in Squel Culmkilla Catholic Town School, felt isolated from her white Irish neighbours and also from the majority of white Irish Catholic church community. So when we interviewed a number of parents who were, vast majority were of Nigerian origin, we found a lot of surveillance of how authentically Catholic they were. And I could talk to you about that for a long time, but this is just an example of what Esther experienced. So Esther said, Father Howard came to our home because I used to go to St. Joseph's Church, but I just stopped it for some time, and I went to my African Pentecostal church in the city. Now she, as I say, she moves between both the African Pentecostal church in the city, and she used to go to the Catholic church in the town, but her son goes to the Catholic school, so that's the level of her interaction. And I think they were asking my son Stephen, which church do you go to? And my son says, we didn't go to this church, we went to the church in the city, as in the Pentecostal one. So the teacher told the Father Howard, she doesn't think we are, and I said, Catholic? Yeah. So I explained to Father Howard, we are Catholic, which they were. I told them that I love to come to their church, but they are not friendly. They can't even say Happy Sunday to you, so I'm not comfortable. I told the Father the way they just, not all of them, don't get me wrong, some people say hi, but the way they just look at you, right? So it's clearly an issue of racialisation in that context, and how they negotiate both an African, the African parents, the Nigerian parents that we interviewed tended to need to view their religiosity a lot more fluidly, partly because they were saying, well, in Nigeria we have so many Christian churches and we move between things. But some Nigerian parents said, no, you're one denomination and that's it. It just depended on the specific local circumstances of the parent, and that informed how flexible they were in terms of their Christianity. But ultimately it was down to making sure that the child belonged with the rest of the community who were often Catholic. So while capable of and needing to negotiate a complex reality, certain minority ethnic parents felt compelled to align themselves with the majoritarian school of worldview definitive of their locality. This was despite the racialized surveillance of Catholic authenticity experienced particularly by Nigerian families in both suburban and town settings. So just to conclude, I haven't shown you all the data. It's kind of been a whistle-stop tour, but I suppose obviously parents are concerned about having a local school, a school nearby to them, a school that they can access easily, and the concern for the children's academic and social well-being was clearly prioritised. They weren't really thinking about, in overtly religious terms, about their child's soul in the context of the school and transcendent goals, if you like, in that respect. But this whole idea of the common concern of children's academic and social well-being, it didn't leave any room for the acknowledgement of the gendered ways in which parents, i.e. mothers, had to do all the work, the racialised ways in which certain minority ethnic parents were surveyed, and the class codes that are used to talk about different school localities. Right. So my argument is we need to think about engagement with plurality, not just in terms of religious and non-religious difference, but also in terms of class, race, gender, and other vectors of power. So, and I suppose the other key part of this is that, our governments, the last two governments in particular, have been creating this fantasy of equally competing individual parents who vote for the school of their choice. I went to a local meeting for a new school, a campaign by a particular patron who was campaigning for votes for a new school, and the whole idea of having patrons compete against each other for parents' interests, to me, it's really problematic for lots of reasons. It tends to present, the school has to market itself in a particular way, which tends to present the school as if its ethos, the way it acts, is homogenous, and that is consistent across the different school settings, when we know that it's not. It puts pressure, I think, on children from minority backgrounds as well to conform to a particular way of being, clearly. So what I'm suggesting is that given the complexity of the different publics, the different localities that I'm talking about here, we need to inject in our policy discourse a discussion about and engagement with complex, unequal publics. And think about mobilities in terms of, obviously, we're talking about residential planning, we're talking about transport, we're talking about lots of different things. And I find what policymakers are doing is extremely narrow in that respect. They're hoping that the discourse of choice is going to change things, when actually the research shows that around the world, marketized school systems, they might provide some small opportunity for certain minority religious groups or other groups to establish a school. But what they tend to do is actually favour the existing majoritarian systems. I've seen that in research across different countries. So it's really important that we begin to change that discourse, or we continue to change that discourse around individual choice and competition.
Thank you so much. Wow, moving beyond the religious and non-religious divide and looking at other issues like gender, ethnicity, class. And I thought that was fascinating. In particular, sometimes we think that parents select schools on the basis of patronage or, programs. Here it was on vibes, on the way that they were looked at, how they were being, welcomed in the school, proximity, geographical proximity. So thank you so much for that. I'm so sorry that we are flying through these such rich papers and so much in each of them. Our last speaker comes from Stranmillis University College. This is Dr. Norman Richardson. who was a partner in our research. His institution was a partner, and he himself is one of the research team. So we're absolutely delighted to invite him here today. We will find out in a second that he is virus-free. And we're coming to the end of the day. It is certainly, you know, we're really looking forward to this. It is not, you know, I suppose we have very little time left, and there will be an opportunity for some questions afterwards. How are we doing time-wise? The room is booked from 4 o'clock onwards, and I appreciate that some people have to go.
Just here.
Okay. So are there any comments just as we're waiting?
Just about the interviewing the parents, did any of the parents allude to the quality of the education, in other words, the grades or the quality of the teaching in the school as being a factor?
They did, but locality was tended to be number one. More middle class parents, yes, tended to talk about quality of teaching. Yeah. And that's consistent with it.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Can we give a big round of applause?
Well, thank you very much. I feel I may have sort of drawn the short straw today, but
last but not least.
Thank you. I'll try to go through this fairly swiftly. And in some ways, this is maybe in a slightly different place, not least because it's a perspective from Northern Ireland, and that's different from some of the context. And yet the thing I've been struck by today is many of the similarities. Some of the issues are obviously different, but there are many similarities in terms perhaps of the psychology of how these things work out. So what I'm going to try to do is to give some kind of overview of research that's been done in Northern Ireland and that I've been involved in over maybe the last 15 years, and try to make some links with this particular project. I always think that's an important cautionary quote from Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of Britain and the Commonwealth. Religion is fire, and like fire it warms, but it also burns, and we are the guardians of the flame. That's from his book, The Dignity of Difference. And actually, although I've often quoted it in relation to Northern Ireland, clearly we can see how this is relevant to many other situations. So maybe that's just a starting thought for the day. It's also maybe useful to say something very briefly about the context of Northern Ireland. We are still a society emerging from conflict, even though the conflict now is almost 20 years behind us in terms of the Troubles. What fuels the conflict, and again this will be well known to people in all parts of Ireland, is a history, the sense of territorial belonging, the sense of culture, but at many points I think it's still true, and not least in Northern Ireland, that these feelings, these powerful feelings, are underpinned by people's perceived religious identity, which may be a practicing identity, it may just be a sense of where people have come from, but it does underpin in so many ways. We also have separate schooling. I know that's not unfamiliar here, but of course in a society which is more almost evenly balanced between, again, a culturally Catholic and a culturally Protestant community, that means that schooling is particularly significantly separate. And that despite the existence of integrated schools, despite the existence of many projects to try to overcome that separation, it's still the case that about 90% of pupils in Northern Ireland continue to go to schools which are largely or entirely of their perceived community. Of course, separate schools mean separate religious education. And if you learn your religious education separately, your understanding of the other is going to be limited. We have a core syllabus for religious education. It's devised by the 4 largest churches, 3 Protestant churches and the Catholic Church, which sounds great, except that the churches have tended to do their own thing. They've tended to define others right outside that, and they've described it as essentially Christian. There is a growing broader ethnic and religious diversity in Northern Ireland, as there has been in the rest of Ireland, and that has added to that complex context. And of course, because of all these factors, there are limited opportunities for contact and dialogue at all sorts of levels, as you'll see in some of this. So this survey is of research that I've been involved in over about the last 15 years on religion, diversity and education. I have to say it's not sort of without, it's not for neutral motives. I've always been concerned to try to make a case for a shared and inclusive approach to religious education that takes diversity more seriously. So I'm not without my motives, and that I'm sure will be very clear. The first one I want to mention is a survey that I was involved in, that I was responsible for in 2003. And we were looking at minority faith parents. This was at a time when the presence of minority faiths in Northern Ireland was significantly growing. It was actually sponsored by the Northern Ireland Interfaith Forum, and we interviewed and did questionnaires with about 76 Muslim, Hindu, Baha'i, Jewish, Buddhist and Sikh parents, all of which had children in schools in Northern Ireland at that time. We looked at the teaching of religious education, provisions for opting out of RE, and accommodation of issues around diet, dress, festivals and so forth. What we found, amongst many findings, was that only a small number of respondents had found that when their children went to religious education in school, that their religion was ever brought into it. It tended to be predominantly Christianity that their children learned. There were a few instances where that was not the case, but the majority found that it was Christian religious education, which was the intention of the syllabus, and at that time the syllabus made no mention whatsoever of world religions of any kind. It's changed a little bit since then, but not too significantly. 2/3 of those interviewed said they were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with religious education in their child's school. This again is just a very brief summary, but what they all said and what we found from this was that there was a need for much greater awareness on the part of teachers, school governors, ancillary staff in schools in terms of the needs of children from other cultures, other religious backgrounds, and that teachers had very limited background knowledge. A few years later, I was involved in a larger project headed by Dr. Alistair Lewinnie, who at that time was in Queen's University, Belfast, and this was on the theme of opting out of religious education. It was focused again on Northern Ireland, but it was used in a wider UK context. So again, we were looking at parents, but also this time also pupils from minority belief backgrounds, including a few who had no religion. We were looking at opt-out or withdrawal provisions as is allowed by law. Many parents, many pupils were critical again of the narrow base of religious education in schools, and especially they focused on, especially when it was doctrinal in nature, when it was attempting to teach Christian truth, which is basically how it was perceived, or just simply when it ignored other faiths, deliberately or unintentionally. And again, there are a lot of findings, and you can still find that online, but what it concluded was that schools needed to really look at the content, not only the content but also the approach of the RE curriculum that they were teaching in order to make it more inclusive and thereby to reduce the need for parents to actually withdraw their pupils and do it in an educational way. And one of our conclusions was that we commended, I'm sure you're familiar with the Toledo Guiding Principles, which I think is a very good base, international base for an inclusive religious education. I've also been involved in about 3 different similar surveys of student-teacher attitudes to religious education and diversity, as you can see, over a period of time. Mostly these were from the 2 Belfast-based separate ITE institutions, Stranmillis, my own institution, and St Mary's University College, though the third of those, the 2011 one, also involved a small cohort from the University of Ulster at Corcoran, and my colleague, part of this project, Dr. Aideen Hunter, was responsible for that. Again, we found, and this bears out a lot of things that people have been speaking about, the great majority of those teachers, or those student teachers, were from Christian backgrounds. Many of them, most of them actually from practicing, to some degree, practicing backgrounds. There were none training to be RE teachers who were from other religions, almost none who said that they didn't really have a religion or believe in religion. Most of those also indicated a fairly conservative or traditional outlook. Many of the Protestants described themselves as evangelical Protestants, for instance. So when we looked at what they understood in terms of Christian and religious diversity, a lot of them said, yes, we've a reasonable knowledge of Christian diversity, which actually I confess I questioned, but that's what they said. They certainly showed very limited awareness of world religions other than Christianity. And again, they'd never studied it at school, so how would they really? There was a reasonable openness to learning about diversity issues and including diversity issues, and a sense that yes, it was important for RE teachers to be open in their approach, but this was always tempered in each of these surveys by a lack of knowledge of religious diversity, especially outside Christianity, and limited opportunities for actually meeting and being with people, even, of course, at the level of Catholic and Protestant. So there is a very sort of brief summary of 3 approaches, and by the way, I've got a written paper which I'll make available if you'd like to share this. I've also asked students from time to time, the first time having been about 10 years ago, to reflect on their, what they've seen of religious education when they've been on placement in schools. It's normally been primary schools because I've worked mostly with primary schools, and that's why I'm particularly interested in the report that we heard earlier today. So they recounted what they found in schools, and many of them recounted very limited, very poor practice, especially in the controlled school sector, which is the sector that has largely traditionally served the Protestant community. And many of them said that diversity seemed to be something you avoided if you could. You didn't go there because it was too big an issue. These are just 2 of the quotes. There's no evidence at all of world religions being taught, despite the fact that there was a classroom with many different cultures, which again has increasingly been the case. Again, another student making a similar point. This school was fairly multicultural, but it was clear that the attitude was that this was a Christian ethos school, and if you come here, you simply accept that and be part of it, or opt out. And of course the opt-out provision has, I think, been sadly used in that sense. If we just keep these diversity issues to one side. There were some examples of good practice, in fairness, and I've done this a number of times over the years, and usually, though not always, but usually this is best in the schools which are integrated, where of course children are from a diverse range of backgrounds. They have to do it. Otherwise they're not sort of meeting the needs of their student body. So that's tended to be a little bit depressing, I have to say. But I'm still doing this from time to time. I also did a survey in 2012 of teachers, of serving teachers, done by questionnaire, and this eventually gathered about 127 schools, controlled schools, that is serving traditionally those that serve the Protestant community, the Catholic maintained schools, and integrated schools. And what this showed was a similar range of views to those that have been discovered in the student-teacher surveys, but obviously from a slightly different perspective. Again, the teachers tended to reveal caution. They were being careful. They weren't sure about this territory, so they were being careful. Some were clearly fairly conservative in their attitudes. They were being cautious. There was certainly a sense, and this was perhaps the first time this came a little more strongly than in the past, some indication of openness, some sense that teachers were beginning to see this is an important area, and especially as pupils get older, this is something that we will have to address. There wasn't a lot of evidence that they were sure how to do it, but it was beginning to come. Many teachers did describe their understanding of religious education as being about the promotion of Christian values, both in all the kinds of schools, really. But again, there was this awareness of the importance of diversity. What again this showed us with the student teachers is that teachers have tended to be seriously lacking in opportunities for training in this regard. They don't have an awareness. There are many very good resources for this territory, but teachers are not generally aware of, and that remains very much the case even today, and especially in relation to diversity issues. The last of these reports, or of these surveys that I want to mention, is one that I was involved in just last year. And it takes a slightly different line, because the concern was that with growing nationalism globally, was this in any way reflected, at least in a society like Northern Ireland, where nationalism has been a significant issue anyway, on the part of student teachers and serving teachers. So this again was done by questionnaire, student teachers and serving teachers. And we were looking at whether there was any evidence of a correlation between approaches to the teaching of RE and the growth of nationalistic attitudes. I devised a nationalism scale, which I need to look at a little bit more, I think. But what I was trying to find out was there anything that suggested that people's attitudes were more or less nationalistic? And various questions were put into it to try to evoke those responses. Again, the political profile and the religious profile of the respondents tended to suggest a fairly conservative or traditional approach. There's a consistency there with the findings of student teachers. It maybe says something about who is going into teaching in Northern Ireland, especially in relation to the teaching of religion. What we found was that British and Irish national identity remains a strong and contentious issue, so there was no doubt about that. There's also immigration was the only of the other issues that seemed to suggest a tendency towards a certain nationalism, and this is in the context, of course, of Brexit and Trump and other influences of that kind. But generally speaking, the other attitudes did seem to be more socially liberal, and I wouldn't describe them as predominantly nationalistic. Many of the teachers, again, seem to have and this is a little bit later than some of the other surveys, have recognised the importance of an open, balanced and fair approach to what they teach and how they teach it. So this was a sort of an appendage to some degree to the other surveys. This has been a whistle-stop tour, obviously, but to me this confirms a number of general conclusions. One is that I do think that all the different elements need to work together, and I'm speaking of within a place like Northern Ireland, but also much more globally, nationally and internationally, to develop a shared and understood, agreed approach to RE, in line with a broad humanities curriculum, and not least in societies where division and religion are still factors. The RE curriculum, I think, and this has, I think, many resonances for what I've heard elsewhere today. The curriculum has to avoid the kind of parochialism that sees us as trying to prepare our children for our background in the future in a way that we've always done, and be much more open and reflect the breadth of religious presence, of various religious views and experiences. And we need, I think, a broadly based and inclusive RE in content and approach. This is my moment of self-promotion. I did a little book a few years ago called Sharing Religious Education, and it's surprising really that people don't think of RE. That's the last thing that a lot of people think of as something that you can do together, whereas for me it's one of the first things we need to do together. So apologies for a little commercial in the middle of all that. I will leave copies actually for Trish and
Thank you so much.
So yeah, so I mean, those are my last two lines, if I may. You know, we need to do this together, and where you have separate schooling, that's a problem. I hope I stayed vaguely within my 20 minutes.
You certainly did. Thank you so much. Listen, you know, for each presentation we've had, for each paper, we could spend a day unpacking the, you know, complex thoughts that are there and the challenges, I suppose, to our own practice. We are at the end of what for us has been a fabulous day, and we have very little time for discussion. And Norman was talking about, you know, the importance of dialogue and engagement and coming together. So just how many minutes do we have, Anne? Are we all out of time?
We have maybe 5-10 minutes.
Okay. Has anybody got any response they'd like to share with us? Any questions they would like to pose to this afternoon's speakers? Comments? Yeah. Marie?
Okay. Well, although we have to start to bring this to an end so that some people can leave, I hope we continue to have the dialogue, even perhaps outside. I thank all 6 speakers, and I know we have a little parting gift for them. It's just a small token of our appreciation for coming and being part of this day. Thank you to all of them. Thank you to yourselves for attending and for your contribution. Norm's talk, last but not least, provided a very nice overview, I think, of some of the key issues. And Norm talked about Jonathan Sacks' dignity of difference, and in a sense, I think that's what many of us have been trying to capture throughout this afternoon and morning. We've had perspectives from geographical locations, Northern Ireland, Limerick, Cork, Galway, Sweden, for example. We've had themes like education students, medical students, family belonging, intercultural education, religious diversity education, and the overlap between race, ethnicity, social class and gender. And the theme of our day was religions and beliefs in changing times. And Norm ended with the fact there's never been a more significant, worrying, post-Trump, post-Brexit, troubling times. But the fact that people like ourselves are here today show that people do care about this. And the last thing I wanted to say is, our subject area seems sometimes like we're a minority special interest group. A minority special interest group in a world of core subjects called literacy, numeracy, STEMs, and they have their place, but the very fact that we came here today suggests that that's not as a minority. And secondly, our special interests that we share may appear to be minority, but actually most people would acknowledge that it's very much part of the majority culture and communities that actually impinge on our lives far more, as if not more, than the other areas that sometimes seem to get priority. So this is the beginning of our ongoing project. I hope you see the links and the possibilities for collaborative research, and we look forward to following your progress as well, and I hope our paths cross again academically and professionally, and I wish you all a safe journey home on behalf of my wonderful team here. Bye-bye.
We have an evaluation sheet to give us some idea, you know, and thanks to the LIT.
Yeah.